Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Bill.
The rabbi asked me to have a discussion about whatever you want to talk about. That's how it started off. And he mentioned this maybe a week or two before Purim. And I thought that was too louder. I thought it was too little time to do anything about Purim. So I decided, well, I'll do something about Passover. And I asked him about how much time I should speak. He said an hour. So I said, okay. So I know we're going to be here till 11. I won't go past that. I have to tell you that I have 5 pages of notes like this, and I cannot possibly imagine that I'll cover one of the pages in an hour. But I'll try to do my best. What I found is that the Seder, when we talk about its origins and how the Seder has evolved, frankly, it has evolved for centuries. And I was just remarking just not too long ago that in my lifetime, the changes for the Jewish people and therefore for the Seder has been enormous. When you think about that, the origins of the Seder are in the 5 books of Moses. In Exodus, which is Shmos, the rules with respect to how the Seder operates and the importance of the initial animal sacrifice of a lamb is all discussed as that obligation to do in celebration of the Jewish people becoming the Jewish people, if you will, and its descent from Egypt and leaving from slavery. And God pronounced that the people are supposed to sacrifice a lamb. They are supposed to meet in their households. And that's why we have the tradition of the Seder, by and large, in the house with family. And the lamb is supposed to be sacrificed and eaten at the home during the course of the Seder. I mean, it's beyond comprehension how it goes from there. We all know, how many cups do we drink on the Seder? Four cups of wine. All of that is in Shmos, in Exodus. I'm sorry. It's really just a remarkable kind of thing that these things can be around for so long, and what the meaning of it is, each one of the cups of wine, and that we do it today. And then we all have the tradition of the 5th cup, which is Elijah's cup. And that's the prophet who is going to, hopefully, we all open up the door after the meal and welcome Elijah the prophet. We literally open up the door. Lots of families have tradition of either children opening up or the person that leads it. Everybody has different traditions, but opening up. Interesting thing, in our lifetime, we have added on also with respect to the 5th cup, the saving of Russian Jewry, Ethiopian Jewry. Who would have thought about those things? And you know, if you look about various Haggadahs, just in the last, in my lifetime, the additions and the changes of it. And that's important because this is a holiday that the adults are supposed to teach the children about the importance of Passover. That's what the 4 questions are. And they're the ones that are supposed to mention the 4 questions. and talk about it and how it goes about answering. And I know that in our family's traditions, it evolved over time where frankly, the grandchildren began to take over the parts that Gramps did. Gramps always read, also clearly in Hebrew, running through it. And over time, the grandchildren were going through yeshiva, so a lot of us were educated. And nobody minded at all that the kids, if you will, would interrupt and say, we need to talk about this because we just learned it, the last couple of weeks. And that just kept on going until the last Seder I attended at home. And that was, and Gramps did that one in 1964. But it's a remarkable kind of thing that this holiday, which is regarded as really the birth, if you will, not necessarily the Jewish people, but of the nation leaving Egypt. I think a lot of us think and talk about, are any of the stories in the Bible true? Or if so, what's truth and what isn't truth? To my knowledge, there has been no archaeology that has disproved anything. Now, the question is, okay, is there only a negative? Well, interestingly, over time, and certainly during my lifetime, there has been a lot more archaeology in the Middle East than when I was born and how it evolved. For the most part, there is the belief that, roughly speaking, the children of Jacob, especially Joseph, but the march of the Jews probably are the Hyksos people that came from the Semitic area to Egypt and eventually took over for about 100 years. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were the Jewish people, but the Semitic people coming roughly the same time that we're talking about. And eventually, they were treated, they really took over. They were too powerful for their own good. History sort of repeats it in that way. And around 1250 BC, when the text in Exodus says, and the Pharaoh did not know Joseph. And that's when they were enslaved by 1250 BC, roughly speaking. King David began his reign roughly in the year 1000 BC. So it's probably a couple of hundred years for 40 years walking around in the desert, eventually taking over in Israel, if you will, and eventually King Saul and his battles with the last vestiges of some of the foreign people in the land of Israel. And King David was the second king, roughly about 1000 BC. Do we have any data that was true, or that Solomon, the following king, built the temple? Not really, except in my lifetime where they were digging around the wall and how much further we're going to dig down. They eventually get to the first temple and the second temple, which is remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. The stones were different. When you go to the wall now, you can certainly see the difference, in the stones, but not all the way down unless you're one of the people that has actually taken a tour to go down. Do you remember anybody walking through where they must have had the stores, if you will? What? Yes. I did see that, but it was certainly not the first few times I went to Israel. That's a relatively new thing. The text of the Hebrew Bible roughly speaking, it is virtually identical to the texts for the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were written about 200 BC. When you think, and those texts are virtually identical to what we read today, and that are the Sefer. Think about that. That's if you don't even assume, if you assume that it was just written, it's at least 2,200 years old. But we do know the tradition of the literate people that did that. That really began roughly 700 or 800 BC. The Jews and frankly the Chinese were the first of the civilizations, if you will, that began to discuss their own backgrounds, and most of it was oral tradition, bringing it along, and eventually it's written down. The one book that was not in the Dead Sea Scrolls was the Book of Esther, and that could just as easily have been that somebody was reading it when the Romans came in and wiped them out. That's a possibility. The Book of Esther is more likely than not to have been the last of the stories, even though the story does talk as if it were roughly 500 BC. It certainly has overtones of the Greeks running the country, if you will, and if you read carefully through Esther, you notice that the king, Ahasuerus, was probably not as popular as he thought he was, even though his main minister and his 10 sons were hung. But he may have been overthrown, which may have coincided roughly with the Romans taking over. So it's hard to tell when Esther was actually written down, or when it was written in the first place. It could date back 500 BC, or it could be maybe 150 BC as well. And it was a relatively new book that was beginning to be written down. We don't know. We don't have a tradition of a newer version until after the Romans take over. So when you think about, we as a people have these rules that have been set down. I've spoken with you about the biblical antecedents, or some of the biblical antecedents. But when you read through the texts, there's an overwhelming notion that God expects us to do a lot of things. But the interesting thing about it is that none of them are so difficult for us as human beings to follow. Maybe some of us are a little bit lazy, but when you think that the list in Leviticus chapter 19 is a gift to the Jewish people, if you will. And I suggest that, to the extent that one can broadly generalize, I do believe that Jewish mothers have a primary responsibility and undertake to do it, regardless of how observant they are with the customs. Love your neighbor as yourself is the central verse in the 5 books of Moses. It's in chapter 19, verse 18. And when you read through the various verses before and after that, even though it certainly starts off with, you are a holy people because I am holy, obey the Sabbath, obey your father and your mother. Don't rob your neighbor, don't steal from your neighbor, love your neighbor as yourself. What's interesting, in verses 33 through 36 of Leviticus, it says, oh, love your neighbor as yourself. Who is your neighbor? It includes the strangers in your midst, because you too were strangers in Egypt. So it's telling the people that when you're in effect, the people that you're going to come across, people that you're living with, you should treat them as you would have them treat you. You should treat them. That isn't really all that difficult. Is there a Jewish mother that essentially doesn't do that? And I mention that for a particular reason. I have 3 daughters and 7 grandchildren. And I see that my grandchildren's parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents were roughly raised the same way. Maybe that's unusual. I'm not so sure that it's that unusual. It doesn't require that every commandment about the observance of Shabbos is done. There are lots of mothers that probably don't know all the rules of Shabbos. And the interesting thing is, under Jewish law, not all those observances are required of women. And you'll say, well, that's terrible. That's being sexist. Actually not. The rationale is there are more important things in the household than worrying about a whole host of other things. It is remarkable. And those are among the things about bringing children at the Seder, because they are as critical to what goes on for the most important holiday in Judaism. In the United States, the most observance of any holiday actually is the Seder, not Yom Kippur. It's the Seder. People flock to it. When we are asked to make sure that the children participate in the search for the chametz, because does everybody know what the search is for the chametz? We learned about it, like lots of, I don't know everybody, we learned about it because we were taught about it in school. And I'm not going to say that my parents didn't know about it, but I can tell you that we brought some of the things back home, including making sure that you light the candle when you're going to check it out, and you say the blessing before the search actually starts, and you make sure that you put some crumbs in the various rooms because you want to dust them off with either a feather or a brush or something like that, and burn it the following morning. Well, I know, I have no idea if my father did that as a kid growing up. I never asked him, but I can tell you, once we discussed it about doing it, that was just part and parcel of what you're supposed to do, including burning the chametz around 9:30 in the morning. It was supposed to be roughly an hour after the Kriyat Shema, so 9:30 was a safe time to do that. And why is that so important? Well, it's got the idea that you're supposed to not have chametz in the house. But you're having children participate in learning these things and playing around with a brush and all that stuff and making sure that everybody has a chance of doing that. That's the best way of inculcating the youngsters, as opposed to a ritual that doesn't have any meaning. You make it a meaning and make them as participants in it. It's really, it's a gift, to say the least. Let's see if I can find. I should tell you, what I have in my books here, there are different versions of the Haggadah. This is Rabbi Kasher's volume. Anybody who has a text of this size. This was used in our household, not this one. This is a relatively new one of the Kasher Seder. But you know, when you think, I wound up getting this for myself because my father had one and my grandfather had one. Why shouldn't I have one of the Kasher ones? The top over here is Manishtana. You see it in bold print 3. It's only the 3 words of Manishtana. It doesn't even have the 4 questions yet. It gets to it. That's page 43. And then the questions are through page 47 with a whole bunch of commentaries thereafter. Our seders would usually last, including eating, roughly 3 hours. But I think it was more leisurely because there was lots of talking. We had the 2 seders. My Aunt Gerd, who lived around the corner from us, did the first seder, and we did the second seder. There were roughly 30 to 40 people that would come to each of the seders. Slightly different people from time to time. My Uncle Nat, my father's younger brother, lived far away. He lived 4 blocks away. And he would go to his in-laws that lived in Elizabeth for the first Seder. So he would come to our house for the second Seder. And Uncle Nat for just added a different dimension to the Seder, among other reasons. He graduated from Harvard Law School, and he was a very, very smart guy. He would always have some discussion, some story that would fit into whatever the topic was going on during the course of the evening, and get everybody to start thinking about some political event or something of that sort, whether a historical event, something that was found. And it was just the kinds of things. Why do I remember that? Because his method of bringing something out, he would get the children to comment about those things that he would do. And that was part of the gig. I don't know that it was anything purposeful or not. On hindsight, it was purposeful. I certainly didn't think of it as that was the trick of it, but that's what we did. We have 2 weeks ago, the Parsha of the week had to do with a community, was a Kohelet, a Kahal, for a group. It is intended that the Seder is a unique Kahal, a unique gathering of people, but it's family and friends. It's the observances for Judaism are both the individual responsibility of love your neighbor as yourself, and a collective observance in going to synagogue for services, for example. We have both elements, individual responsibility and collective responsibility. Shortly, as we were going through the desert, was the time that they were building the traveling temple, if you will. That's where they did some of the accoutrements that were going to be in the temple. During the course of its construction, Moses went up to get the 10 Commandments, and the Jewish people got antsy because he didn't come back from the mountain as soon as they expected him to. There wasn't any timeline given or not, but they assumed that it was and started a rebellion that led to the golden calf. The interesting thing about the golden calf story is just before it and just after it, it talks about the construction of the Mishkan, of what the people are supposed to bring, including gold and silver and related kinds of expensive stuff. And how they had all of this stuff leaving Egypt as slaves is also highly interesting. There are lots of stories about it, none of which are necessarily in the text, although there are elements, especially in the plague dealing with darkness, that they collected a lot of the things that they had before the Egyptians denuded them of their wealth. Remember, I told you that they came around to Egypt around 1700 BC, and by 250, they were already slaves. So one of the theories is that they were collecting their stuff, if you will, and eventually a lot of that stuff was used in the construction of the temple. The reason why I raise that is it talks about the collection, the community aspect of this holiday and the uniqueness that it's done in the home as opposed to the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur service or the other ones. Sukkot, the Feast of the Tabernacles in the fall, has a combination of both, where you go to services and then you come, especially on the first night, you come home and have the meal in the sukkah. The first night, of course, there are 8 nights to it. I think we, during the morning service that we read every day in Exodus, there's regular goes, Oz Yashim Moshe. Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. They said, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. This chapter 15 in Exodus is all about the march from Egypt to freedom and going through the Red Sea and some of the things expecting to happen going through. But I wanted to talk about 15. We have with us the tzitzis that are worn in the talus. In the prayer in the book of Numbers, chapter 15, when they talk about the fringes, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelite and instruct them to make for themselves fringes on the corners of their garments through the ages. That shall be your fringe. Look at it and recall all of the commandments of the Lord and observe them, so that you do not follow your heart, and eyes in your lustful urge. Thus you shall be reminded to observe all my commandments and to be holy to your God. I am the Lord and your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I mentioned before in Leviticus, chapter 19. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the whole Israelite community and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. What do you think verse 3 is? You shall each revere your mother and your father and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do you think that the Pharaoh of Egypt has had some commandment like that to his people? I don't think so. You shall follow what I demand of you. And he certainly enslaved a lot of people. The Jews were not the only ones that were enslaved. Do not turn to idols or make molten gods for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. I'll read verse 9. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not pick your vineyard bare or gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. Do you think that that has any relevance today? All the business about tithing eventually is spelled out in the Talmud. And instead of parts of people's farms, which is what a lot of people had 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, such a thing as taxes. And we Jews recognize that we have our own obligations, that we make them obligations to the various, whether it's the synagogues, whether it's for Israel, a variety of things. But our focus generally is to take care of the poor, the sick, and the women who are and the orphans. That's a requirement for us. And I just say, you shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. You shall not steal. You shall not deal deceitfully or falsely with one another. You shall not swear falsely my name, profaning my name. You shall not defraud your fellow. You shall not commit robbery. The wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until morning. That rule applies for people that are only paid on a daily basis. If you're paid weekly, it's got to be paid before the next week. You don't really see books of this sort. I defy anybody that pick a book that's 2,000 or 3,000 years old with these minutia kinds of things. And I believe very strongly also that that's not to say that non-Jewish people don't have the Jewish mothers in their houses. It just happens to be that most Jewish mothers do these things. And that's so critical. It's so critical for us. I have to tell you, I don't remember my mother ever saying, wait till your father gets home. I have to tell you that. I do want to point out something that I mentioned of the kinds of things that we are supposed to do in this famous chapter. And this has so precious to us. This is the verse, it's verse 15, that speaks of the judicial system. You shall not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Judge your kinsmen fairly. That's a little bit different than love your neighbor as yourself. A judge does not have that responsibility. The judge, in effect, can't feel sorry for the poor or take care of the wealthy. It's got to be even justice. It's so simply read and so important. And you're asking why am I talking about that for the Seder? Because I think from time to time, this might be something that would be discussed at this year's Seder because of what's going on with the potential criminal aspects of it. And it wouldn't surprise me that at the Seder that will be a topic of conversation, at least the Seders that I've been used to, where issues of the day usually come up, especially when there's a mixture of people of different ages. There's never usually a quiet time, but somebody may have that on their mind and one person says it to the next, and before you know, 30 people are talking about it. And I think that might come up this year. Let's talk about the matzah. The matzah derived because the Jewish people were supposed to have this dinner with lamb, and then they were rushed to depart quickly because the Egyptians were going to be coming on the way. One of the last, the last plague was the death of the oldest child, and there were lots of deaths. The interesting thing, at least what I studied in yeshiva, was that the Egyptian men and women were loose. I don't know how else to say it, and it's suggested that the firstborn would be to the firstborn of the male of any combination or the female of any combination, so that if some guy was messing around with more than one woman, the first child of each one of those pairs would be considered it. And for a woman who may have been loose, if there was another, because there were an awful lot of babies that were dead. The Egyptians that didn't realize, or at least weren't told, that it was the death of the firstborn, even though they were warned that, because there were too many and it didn't make any sense. And it didn't make any sense, as was pointed out later in the Talmud, that I guess with some of the rabbis thereafter opined that could have been why there were so many, and that they didn't know what was going to happen, and that was one of the things that they better get rid of these people and throw them out and get them away. And because so many were dying, that's when they came after them to see if they could do damage to them. So they had the Jews running, and then they were quickly followed. But when they started to make the bread the night before, they were rushed, and it's just hard to tell why we have this rule, because water and the flour can't be together for more than 18 minutes. And I have no idea how that came up or why it came up, but it's just what we're used to. I assume that everybody has seen the Manischewitz or Streitz matzah, but I think that many of us have already seen that the handmade matzah called shmur matzah. It's larger, it crumbles, it's very difficult to, that there's actually 3 for the Seder, or for 2 Seders, that you'll find 6 that aren't already cracked in some fashion. But I have to tell you that the thing with the shmur matzah when I was growing up was really not around very early for me. It became in the 1950s is when shmur matzah started to appear. It wasn't earlier on. I have no idea why. I mentioned that I'm from Elizabeth. Elizabeth is on the other side of the Goethals Bridge. It goes between Staten Island and New Jersey. And so I'm virtually in New York City, where you would think shmur matzah would have been around. I think it was just a novel kind of thing that happened in the 50s. Does anybody remember shmur matzah earlier? No. I know we had it around, sometime in the mid 50s. Just so you get a clue what I say about the observance. My father was one of the key volunteers of getting either half gallon or gallon, not either, both. And there used to be a time that it was the synagogue and the yeshiva would distribute wine for people who wanted for the seders. My father was just one of the people that would go into New York. I remember the car getting loaded up with cartons of half gallon and gallons of these things, and going around Elizabeth, dropping them off for the people that didn't. I don't remember how much it was, but it was either Kedem or Shapiro, or I don't know what the names are. Never met a chef. It's interesting, but that wasn't good enough. But and my father just diligently did that. And I have to say, I was, especially on Sundays, I would go with him to help him do that stuff. And it's such a, it's a fascinating kind of thing. Also, for people that are familiar with getting the house ready for cleaning out, that was also the time of spring cleaning too, which we took it seriously. So part of the spring cleaning was also moving the storm windows to the
basement?
No. Yeah, well, yeah, but the ones with
the screens,
the screening.
Oh,
we had
the basement?
Oh, yeah, no, upstairs in the attic.
Oh, okay.
So that was just part of it. Which Sunday are we going to do that on? So.
There's no one here who grew up in Florida, so no one said, what are storm windows?
Oh.
Everybody here came from a colder place
Yes.
at one time or another.
We don't have to go to Florida.
No, they don't know. The people, if they grew up in Florida, they would say, what was it? Yeah.
Oh, they don't
But
know.
we're all from colder climates.
Yes.
Yeah, oh, I thought you said that.
Yeah.
I wanted to also discuss something that's very interesting about animal sacrifices. They are laid out very carefully in the 5 books of Moses, continuing on through the rest of the biblical texts. And the Talmud goes through it in a remarkable way. The Mishnaic period, that's the early period, started roughly 300 BC, and eventually it ran through the Gemara part, the Talmud part, that lasted from maybe 50 BC or 50 AD, roughly when that started for the next period, until 500 AD. So it's roughly 800 years of what we now call the Gemara, the Talmud. I mean, it's roughly that period. And then the early rabbis were called the Rishonim. The latter ones, like Rashi and the Rambam, are Achronim, the latter ones that go through roughly 1100 AD. All these commentators that start with the Mishnah, and they didn't start writing down the Mishnah part. It was still an oral tradition. It started to be written down by Rabbi Judah, the prince, they call him. Roughly 100 AD is when they actually started to write it, because the diaspora was starting, and if they didn't start writing down the oral Torah, nobody would remember it. So that's when the oral Torah was begun to be written after people were already deceased. And yet the notions of what would happen when the temple would come back would be the third temple, and what to do and what the rules are. And the rules are very, when you read through the text, you say, I don't understand what's going on. There's not anybody that can understand the sacrifices and why they're so detailed. But that goes on even in some parts of the Talmud when there wasn't a temple. And Maimonides, the Rambam, he lived roughly 1000 AD, took the position, a very radical position, that animal sacrifices are no longer a part of what will happen when there's the next temple, because the Jewish people and the world, if you will, have moved past the notion of animal sacrifice. He was highly regarded at the outset. He was not highly regarded for when he came out with this pronouncement. And certainly by his death, he was more widely acclaimed than ever. In fact, most people wouldn't even know what I've just said about his position about the animal sacrifices. But there was a period when he mentioned it. The reason why I'm mentioning it, that is a serious, serious change to our worship. I think people that don't know the rule wouldn't even begin to think of it. But Judaism is especially unique, and the reason why I believe Judaism has lasted so long is that it never stops. We learn things which we hadn't seen before. Jews don't believe that the notion of science is not something that is bad for our religion. We cheer it on, for want of a better word, because if nothing else, civilization learns things, and there are new ways of learning things. So the notion of our view is God gave Moses the Torah, and that's the written Torah. And our rabbis have opined 1,000 years later that the oral Torah was also transmitted on Sinai. Was also transmitted then. It's just that we have to we learn about these new things as a people go. That's part of what the rabbis 2,000 years came up with, so that Judaism remains a very live religion throughout. Can you imagine that if we built the temple, nobody here in this room would think that we're going to start bringing animal sacrifices. It's certainly comfortable to at least know that we don't have to worry about it, because one of the great rabbis of 1,000 years ago said, we're not going to do that anymore because it's not acceptable to us. I find that the reason why the Seder is so important is that we do new things with the Seder based on how we are living. And I think what's remarkable in my lifetime, to think about how the Seder necessarily has changed in such a fashion that the concept of slavery in Egypt is foreign, but this is a generation that fortunately were not around during the Holocaust. But shortly thereafter, we are. And the notion of why that's so important to us, we want to make sure that our children when it comes to the Seder, are going to learn about why Jews are so unique and why it's something that we learn. You know, the idea that we would actually have a temple, I don't know what in the world people would have thought about in the concentration camps. I mean, yes, they sometimes did have, however, they managed to have a Seder. God only knows what they did and how they would have something like that. But they didn't, you know, a lot of the people didn't give up. There were just as many people that observed or didn't observe, no matter what. Jews have a habit of doing that. But just think how we view Judaism today, that we wouldn't have dreamed it 100 years ago. And when we were having the issues with the Russian Jewry and how, you know, frankly, the Americans did it, the birth of Israel. I mean, when we talk about this, can you imagine what the Haggadahs look like? Someday we'll have the temple. I mean, it was nonsense. Now we do expect Elijah to walk through the door. I think some of the Christians think that he has, but I'm not so sure. But I think what's remarkable about the contemporary nature of the Seder is exceptionally unique for any religion. Particularly, we're blessed to have a notion that as the world evolves and as people evolve, our religion evolves. Our notion of, frankly, what God is evolves. When you read through the text here, there's certainly a notion that it's a personal God. Contemporary notions of Judaism is that God is beyond time and space, and therefore the human mind cannot comprehend God. Have you ever had any discussions at any time with any of your friends about what God is or what it's going to be like in heaven? Jews do not talk about that. It's not part of their conversation. And it's not that they don't believe or do believe. It's sort of like, if there's a heaven, we'll find out about it. We're not going to waste our time doing it because no one knows the answer. We do know that when we lose somebody, we certainly pray that they will have a better life elsewhere, but we don't know what it is. And I'm sure that's, you know, after the pain of losing somebody, that pain is just not as harsh a few years later as it is, and it strikes tough early on. And humans have that ability of necessarily coping because part of living is dying. And we have to, you know, deal with those things. And we have to, frankly, teach our children how to deal with those things. Anyway, it's an hour and nobody has said anything. No one has asked any questions. So does that mean that no one, oh, thank God. Yes.
What does Pesach mean to you?
Everything I've spoken about. It's just one of these things that, I mean, literally, I've only gotten to the second page and I haven't done very much on the first page. What I regard about this holiday is that it's a holiday for today and thinking about what's going to be tomorrow. I mean, who would have thought? We were just talking about the 6-Day War. Before the 6-Day War, the temple was a wall that the camels were at. They didn't have a big plaza that's been in Jerusalem for only 40 years. But before that, it was a place where the camels were walked. So that's what I think it's contemporary. So I have a question.
You know, let me have some insight into October Purim with Mordecai and Esther.
Yeah, actually, I was born in the city of Shushan.
That's right, I remember, yes.
Yes, on the University of Padira.
Yes.
I was born in the city of Shushan. The tomb of Esther and Mordecai was maybe half an hour walking, 10 minutes, driving from there, really. And unfortunately, you know, the city has changed a lot. In 1500s, there were 50,000 Jews in that city.
No,
Today, there are
500?
zero.
Zero.
In fact, the tomb of Esther and Mordecai now is from Muslims. But as you were talking, some of the things that was really interesting to me is what has changed. Absolutely nothing. When I was a kid, the Pesach was celebrated exactly as we do now, except the Jews had a place to make matzah like what they made 1,000 years ago in that fashion, and also they had sacrifice. So that too is no longer. But basically, no matter where you live, Jews are exactly the same.
That reminds me, what I did want to mention. I think most of us have been used to horseradish as it's not really clear exactly what it is. The commentaries in the Talmud discusses 5 different vegetables. As best as we can regard them is actually romaine lettuce is probably even more so than horseradish. And what I learned through studying for today is that endive is another one of the vegetables that is also for bitter herb. And I know in our household, when I learned about romaine lettuce, I know I was the kid that mentioned it for the Seder. And so what we wound up doing is have both romaine lettuce and horseradish, and part of the sandwich, if you will, was those two. And now that I've learned about endive, I'm going to make sure that endive is going to be part of it as well. It's a little bit bitter, which is supposed to be, but then of course, horseradish is pretty rough stuff. But it's, you learn something new all the time. Yes.
We still use the addition of the Maxwell House.
No, we don't. No, we don't.
It's the same thing.
We do not. We use the gopher. I don't, you know, accept, we don't.
He's sick.
We do not use it. It's so user unfriendly.
It's,
Well, I have to tell you, this Haggadah is not user unfriendly. It's just, it's wonderful.
I beg your pardon, no.
By the way, this one, I did make notes to it. This is called the Scholars Haggadah. I think maybe some of the rabbis that were teachers must have had something like that before, because that's another fabulous thing.
You know, when you were talking about the matzah and how the 18 minutes and all, I think it's very interesting that matzah is referred to in 2 ways that are so diametrically opposed. The bread of our affliction,
Yes,
the bread of our liberation.
right.
I mean, the 2 completely, and they're both true,
And they're both true.
and they're both true.
See, we enjoy having the pain come with the good things.
No pain, no gain.
You know.
we've added a Miriam cup,
The
a
Mary,
cup of water.
Yes,
the Last few years, and some extra reading.
what kind of wine do you use for that, Miriam?
no, it's water, because Miriam was the one who led
Yeah,
the dance at the.
Yes, that's the one that, remember I did Oz Yashir, I mentioned the Oz Yashir
Right.
before. Yeah. I didn't realize that it was water. But that 5th cup has been used a bunch of different times, different ways.
For different types of liberation.
Anyway, thank you very
Bill.
much.
Thank you, Bill.
Dai,